For over a quarter of a century, despite technical challenges and financial burdens, Vanderbilt University has ensured that a trusted, independent record of television news is preserved and available to everyone. According to a story in the November 1991 issue of Texas Monthly magazine, Dan Rather said that he lives with two burdens, the ratings and the Vanderbilt Television News Archive. He stated, "I always say about anchoring, there's no place to hide, and from Vanderbilt, there's no escape." In the past, the archive secured financial support that enabled it to remain independent. Today, however, financial support has eroded to a dangerously low level, and new sources of funding are actively being sought. The Vanderbilt Television News Archive is an American treasure. It is not only a collection of newscasts and special reports, but America's library of who we were then and what events have shaped our lives. The Vanderbilt Television News Archive is our history in pictures and sound. It is more than mere words on paper. It is the images that tell our story.
Along Highway 9.
Saturday, 53 GIs refused an order to advance in the face of enemy fire near the Laotian border. Today, they were back in the field, and they are not going to be punished. Brigadier General John Hell Jr. says that if he went by the book, the men could be taken out and shot. Instead, he has relieved their captain, Carlos Provida. The Army says he's a young officer, a little lacking in experience. North Vietnamese troops also were on the offensive near the Laotian royal capital of Laos.
Direct from our newsroom in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And in Washington, Eric Seberide, Roger Mudd, Bob Schieffer, Robert Pierpoint, Jed Duval in Khe Sanh, South Vietnam, Bob Simon in Brussels, Belgium, John Lawrence in Belfast, Northern Ireland, and Bill McLaughlin in Dhaka, East Pakistan.
Good evening. Some American helicopters and their crews are pulling back from Khe Sanh tonight as the South Vietnamese campaign in Laos appears near its end. Latest reports say only about 2,000 South Vietnamese are still in Laos and that they've abandoned all but one fire base, that located 6 miles from the border. That South Vietnamese armored column that was trapped on Highway 9 last night broke through the enemy roadblock, ran several ambushes, but finally made it to Khe Sanh. But even there, the enemy kept up the pressure. Under cover of an artillery and rocket barrage, some 40 commandos armed with satchel charges attacked the base and destroyed or damaged 5 helicopters. 8 other American bases in the border area also came under attack during the day. Back in the Khe Sanh area were the 2 platoons of Bravo Company, which over the weekend had refused an order to advance. Jed Duval reports.
The soldiers call this a track. It is officially an armored personnel carrier, and it's the basic machine for patrolling roads in a combat area. The soldiers in these tracks belong to Bravo Troop, 1st Squadron, 1st Cavalry, Americal Division. These 2 platoons, some 50 men in all, were pulled back to this rear base near Khe Sanh after refusing an order to move down Highway 9. Their troop commander, a captain, has been relieved of his command. The men had been told to go and guard a damaged personnel carrier or a track. Their officers were willing, but the men were not. Were you one of the organizers or what?
Not so much an organizer, but I was a staunch supporter, you might say.
Spoke up?
Yes, I did.
Why?
Well, I felt that the reason they wanted us to go back down there wasn't a very good reason. It was after a piece of machinery that could have been replaced. This was the colonel's own words, and I didn't see any sense in risking any more lives, because when we went down earlier to get the captain, we caught all kinds of hostile fire, and it just didn't seem worth it to go after radio or risk any more lives.
You one of the men who went in and got the captain and his crew?
Yes, I was.
Did you volunteer for that?
Yes, I did.
Now, did the men talk among themselves? Did they have a big meeting or what?
Yes, well, it was more like each crew from each track got together, and then a couple of them got together And as the conversations went along, everybody's ideas came out, then it was decided that nobody wanted to go back in. If we could stick together as a group, we thought maybe it would be, bring some effect upon leaders.
Do you think any of you will be in trouble?
I hope not. I hope not. I don't think it should. They should have relieved our captain, since it wasn't his fault that we did this. But
You say you don't think they should have relieved him?
no, I don't. He really he wouldn't have been able to make us go in either. The colonel asked us, and we refused him, so that they shouldn't have taken it out on the captain like they did.
The brigade commander, Brigadier General John G. Hill, Jr., told newsmen that, quote, "I could take these men out and shoot them," but said he would take no action because they are still in the field and they are, as he said, doing their duty. I've asked many of the men here in Bravo Troop if they felt that the refusal to save the broken track was justified, and they said that it was. I asked them if they are willing to go back into action tomorrow, and they said yes, if the action is justified, they're willing to go. Jed Duval, CBS News, with Bravo Troop at Khe Sanh.
The Defense Department conceded today that the South Vietnamese might have stayed longer in Laos if they had not run into such heavy enemy resistance. Pentagon spokesman Jerry Friedheim said the battle plan for ending the drive involved several possible alternatives, quote, based on the realities of the situation. In his televised interview last night, President Nixon complained that news reports had concentrated on the South Vietnamese troops that had gotten into trouble in Laos. He said this was just 4 of the 22 battalions committed to the Laotian campaign. Bob Schieffer reports from the Pentagon.
Asked today to identify the 4 battalions referred to by the President, Pentagon officials said they could identify only one, the 39th Rangers, a unit which fled from a fire support base called Hill 30. The Pentagon could give no clue as to the identity or the designation of the other units. In Saigon, the command also declined to identify the units, saying only 1 was airborne and 2 came from the 1st Division. At a weekend briefing arranged for newsmen in Saigon, an official who could be identified only as a military source also mentioned that 22 battalions were committed to the fighting. He said 4 had been pulled out when their combat effectiveness came into question. He made no mention of those that have come out since. The Pentagon's official spokesman, Jerry Friedheim, offered no comment on the President's remarks. However, he noted that the first units out of Laos were the hardest hit, and he said their arrival at rear areas did generate news stories. Newsmen covering the Laotian campaign operate under the strictest ground rules of the war. They are forbidden to ride in U.S. helicopters and must confine their trips into Laos to 1 U.S. press helicopter. Sometimes they can hitch rides with the South Vietnamese, but many times the South Vietnamese also refuse to take them. As a result, much of their information about Laos comes from returning U.S. helicopter pilots, whose assessments of the campaign, for the most part, have been far more pessimistic than the reports offered by the official spokesman in Washington and Saigon. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.
Laotian Premier Prince Suvarnabhumi has made an urgent appeal to Britain.
After 45 days of fighting, the South Vietnamese today ended their thrust into Laos. The last fire base was closed this morning, and 2,000 troops marched back across the border toward Khe Sanh. Only a scattered rear guard remains. Even though the invasion is at an end, intense fighting continues nearby. Khe Sanh was pounded with rockets and artillery all day, and Allied troops along Rt9 were under constant attack. ABC's Steve Bell was with those troops yesterday as they fought their way back out of Laos.
For U.S. support units on Highway 9, the withdrawal phase has been more difficult than the advance. Armored units like this one, with signs and symbols of gallows humor, have run an ambush gauntlet near the border. The objectives: to retrieve damaged equipment and to keep the road open for South Vietnamese armor trying to break out of Laos. Lieutenant John Fitzgibbons, a platoon leader, speaks bitterly about the experience. How do you feel about going back in there every day with the same results?
I feel horrible about it. My men are scared. They're waiting. Every day it's coming closer and closer. We lost a lot of men out there. We lost a lot of vehicles. People are shook up. We don't like going in. It's the last time we're going to do it.
What if you were ordered to do it again tomorrow?
If I was ordered again to do it tomorrow, I'd probably go in and do it. All I can say is I hate to do it. My track's hold up. I just hope we can make it through today.
How does all this make you feel about the whole operation from your perspective?
In my perspective, the operation is, from my point of view, it's not a success. Too much attention was given to the ARVNs, not enough support to the Americans. We took heavy casualties out there. We were fired on for over 50 days with heavy artillery. Nobody found the gun. said the casualties were too severe for the situation.
There was strong feeling among the Americans that this should be the last day. If the South Vietnamese were to break through, it would have to be now. And the evidence of previous ambushes clogged the roadside as a stark reminder of other trips.
Now we're under fire. The armored column is stopped. The tanks, the APCs, the individual GIs, all firing as we're catching incoming light arms fire and an occasional mortar.
After the first round of incoming mortar, the trip was steadily punctuated by gunfire. Often the column would stop to form a brief defensive cluster with other units. Then it was back on the move again, with GIs firing constantly at potential trouble spots. The dilemma for the Americans is an old one. While their vehicles are glued to the narrow roadway and the few cluster points, the enemy zeroes in from bunkers and deep ambush. The Americans have the firepower, but in terrain like this, they seldom see their targets. Then came the welcome sight. 4 days after their main base in Laos had been evacuated, the first units of South Vietnamese armor broke through to Vietnam. While so many others had not made it back from Laos, they had, after weeks of being cut off and under pressure. But the fighting wasn't over yet. This time there were casualties on our perimeter. 1 American killed, several wounded. Helicopter gunships were now flying support, while medevacs darted in for the wounded. But the South Vietnamese were back, and for the Americans, it was a big step toward the finish of security operations so close to the border.
Steve Bell, ABC News, with American armor on Highway 9.
South Vietnam claims that 80 to 90% of its goals in Laos were accomplished, but here in Washington, Defense Secretary Laird said the mission was cut short because of, quote, violent and vicious attacks by the communists. Behind the scenes, the official appraisals are still underway, as ABC's White House correspondent Bill Gill reports. Informed Washington sources say privately that Saigon's troops have failed to accomplish the maximum goals of the Laos invasion. Original plans had called for disruption of the Ho Chi Minh Trail until the start of the rainy season next May. But enemy counterattacks forced to pull out 6 weeks early. Originally, Saigon's forces were to pull back slowly, sweeping south from Highway 9, wiping out huge enemy supply caches. Again, enemy counterattacks destroyed that plan, sending the South Vietnamese hurrying homeward along their route of entry. According to these sources, Saigon's inability to carry out its full mission has eliminated any thought of a possible invasion by the South Vietnamese of North Vietnam. Disruptions in Laos were confined, we're told, to a narrow wedge of territory along Highway 9 from Khe Sanh to Chepon. Bill Gill, ABC News, Washington. It may be many months after the rainy season is over before we can be certain who won or lost. But these were the claims from Saigon today, that 176,000 tons of communist ammunition were destroyed and that 13,672 communist soldiers died. But the cost has been high. The South Vietnamese sent in 24,000 men and 1,146 of them died. American losses will be announced tomorrow. ABC News reports from Saigon that half the Allied tank force of about 200 may have been lost. And the future's left in doubt. The Pentagon said today that more sorties like this are possible, but none are being actively planned.
There are a few hundred, perhaps 1,000 South Vietnamese Marines still inside Laos tonight, holding a ridge that overlooks the border. But after 45 days, the operation against the Ho Chi Minh Trail there is over. However, the fighting goes on. The North Vietnamese chased the retreating soldiers right up to the border, and American planes protecting the withdrawal knocked out 6 more enemy tanks today. There also were enemy rocket and mortar attacks during the day against American bases near Laos. Khe Sanh was shelled for the 10th straight day, with about 100 rounds hitting the airfield. As it stands tonight, official American figures list 89 helicopters lost in the campaign, with 51 Americans killed and 28 missing. The South Vietnamese say they lost 1,145 men, more than 200 are missing, and more than 4,200 wounded. Those figures add up to about a quarter of the total force sent into Laos February 8th. They claim they killed more than 13,600 communists. Highway 9, the key road in the Laotian campaign, has turned into a death trap near the Laos border, and Jed Duval reports.
The convoy makes up west of Khe Sanh. The young soldiers wait for the order to start, waiting in their tracks, armored personnel carriers, plus the trucks and tanks that will go along. Some of the machines are decorated in a morbid bravado that is supposed to defy the real danger they are soon to face. A stretch of road that must be traveled, a dusty lane that the North Vietnamese have turned into one long ambush.
You can hear it now. The shooting has begun. North Vietnamese fired at the CT. You can hear the Americans firing. Shooting their machine guns and their M16s.
This gives you some idea of what it's like to go riding up and down Route 9. These soldiers have been doing it every day since the invasion began, and for the last week, it's been like this. The enemy's rocket-propelled grenades, and now we're told mortars.
No one can see an enemy soldier. The ambushers could be 2 or 20. A small burst of rifle fire from the bushes produces renewed clatter from the tanks and trucks. These films were taken by CBS News cameraman Norman Lloyd. The scene was today's Vietnam War itself, compressed in time and space. The dead GI, casualty of this small engagement, fought by a small group. And driving past them, South Vietnamese troops by the hundreds, the first of the South Vietnamese armor to return from Laos, coming back down the road they had used on the day of the invasion 6 weeks earlier.
The North Vietnamese have escalated their boycott of the Paris peace talks. For 3 weeks, their chief negotiators have not attended the weekly meetings.
Your trust.
Defense Secretary Laird conceded today that what he's been calling the vicious and violent reaction by the communists in Laos did in fact cut short the South Vietnamese drive there. With the Laos campaign over, other assessments are being made in the Pentagon, as Bob Schieffer reports.
Senior U.S. commanders had hoped the South Vietnamese would stand and fight the North Vietnamese during the Laotian campaign. But that hope was crushed when South Vietnam's President Thieu refused to commit additional troops to the battle. That is the thrust of an assessment of the campaign given to CBS News by an authoritative source. According to the source, President Thieu wanted an operation to disrupt supply lines in Laos, knowing this would probably be his last opportunity to launch an operation with massive U.S. support. Once the operation was underway and once the South Vietnamese reached the Laotian town of Saigon, it became evident that the North Vietnamese would resist in force. They abandoned their usual tactics of hit and run and began to mass their forces as if for a set battle. It was at this point that some senior U.S. commanders and some members of Thieu's own general staff suggested flying in additional South Vietnamese troops and making a fight of it. But Thieu rejected the suggestions, apparently feeling high casualties might endanger his own chances for re-election later this year. After that, the operation simply became a withdrawal. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, the Pentagon.
During the 45 days of the Laotian campaign, the Senate doves have been unusually silent. Marvin Kalb reveals why.
One major reason for the relative quiet relates to an informal deal made by the Nixon administration and Senate doves at a closed-door meeting of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on February 9th, the morning after South Vietnamese troops crossed into Laos. The witnesses that day were Secretary of State Rogers and General John Vogt, the Pentagon's top war briefer. Secretary Rogers urged the committee to avoid a domestic fuss, as he is said to have put it, by restraining and toning down anti-war criticism. The senators, including Chairman Fulbright, were assured no U.S. ground troops would be used in Laos, and they reluctantly agreed to the Secretary's request. This followed an upbeat briefing by General Vogt. He said the Laos mission would last until at least May 1st. The hub town of Sapone would be captured within 2 weeks, perhaps less. The South Vietnamese army would then proceed westward beyond Sapone and cut or block all communist supply lines running south. According to several senators, the general also said that the communists would be outnumbered and outgunned by the South Vietnamese. This optimistic scenario proved to be faulty, the result, senators believe, of bad intelligence, not of a deliberate administration effort to mislead them. Nevertheless, they consider the restraints imposed by the February 9th deal to be lifted now that the operation in Laos is over. Fulbright is considering ways of declassifying the Rogers vote testimony. Cooper and Church are planning to introduce new legislation stating the president's only authority in Indochina is to withdraw U.S. troops swiftly, not to go ahead with his favorite program of Vietnamization. Javits and Eagleton are pushing legislation to define the president's war-making powers. Thus, the end of the Laos operation may well have the ironic effect of kicking off a new anti-war storm on Capitol Hill. Marvin Kalb, CBS News, Washington.
The Democratic Policy Council, which guides the party on issues, today unanimously called for total U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam by the end of this year. The Council's resolution said that announcement of such a deadline should be used to negotiate speedy release of Americans held prisoners of war and to obtain an early ceasefire and meaningful peace negotiations in Paris. On another matter, the Council's chairman, Senator Humphrey, accused that North Vietnamese artillery that the Pentagon reported yesterday was in the demilitarized zone opened fire today, killing or wounding several South Vietnamese soldiers at Dong Ha, a base 11 miles below the DMZ. The South Vietnamese headquarters also reports that the North Vietnamese are bringing surface-to-air missiles closer to the DMZ, and that for the first time they also have been set up along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. The American command says enemy activity in the DMZ is 50% greater than last month, and that most of that activity is in the southern half of the zone. Saigon today flew several fresh battalions into Khe Sanh and the border area to beef up the battered troops who were in Laos. Jed Duval reports on some of the government troops who got out.
Vietnamese expected no picnic along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, of course, but neither did they foresee the North Vietnamese strength that showed itself a week after the invasion began. Human wave attacks, a sudden return to conventional warfare from the hit-and-run tactics of the guerrilla. The volume of tanks and artillery of the communists was not expected. Route 9 was never opened as deeply into Laos as the High Command had hoped. The armored column on the road came out with roughly half the vehicles, tanks and personnel carriers, that it drove in. American helicopters, which took most of the South Vietnamese into Laos, were relied on to bring them out. Some of these pullbacks have been disorderly, panicky, not with these troops. These men belong to the Airborne Division, one which has always had a good reputation. They left no weapons scattered behind them in Laos, as had units of the 1st Division. On arrival at their base near Khe Sanh, the troops formed automatically into squad rank and file. One of their advisors was waiting for the unit to return. The advisor, Sergeant Russell Bateman, had not seen the men in 45 days.
Did they indicate they were able to inflict heavy casualties on the North Vietnamese?
I know they did.
They did, huh?
Raj, I've seen the equipment we've sent back, and the body counts that they're getting are real good.
These men made an orderly withdrawal on foot. They said the enemy was very strong, that there was much death on both sides.
Jed Duval, CBS News, Dong Ha, South Vietnam.
The State Department is thinking about giving the communists a taste of their own medicine at the Paris peace talks. Diplomatic correspondent Marvin Kalb.
There was enemy shelling again today of the U.S. Firebase Marianne, 50 miles south of Da Nang, as reinforcements came in and the wounded went out after Sunday's surprise ground attack by the enemy. 33 Americans of the Americal Division were killed in the raid and 76 wounded. It was the largest death toll of Americans in a single engagement in 4 years. One military source in Saigon blamed lowered security by troops who were about through with their Vietnam tour. To the northwest, the South Vietnamese canceled a proposed raid in force on a supply depot 20 miles inside Laos. Fog and dust kicked up by bombing in preparation for the raid had reduced visibility, and anti-aircraft fire was judged too strong to send in the 40 American helicopters carrying the raiding party. South Vietnamese forces continue reconnaissance missions inside and along the Laotian border with U.S. support. ABC's Steve Bell reports.
Most of the South Vietnamese forward headquarters near Laos are now being dismantled, but this one remains active. It's the Marine headquarters, and the Marines are the ones who are still fighting up to and across the Laotian border. Each day, American helicopters fly in and out of here, carrying reconnaissance teams, reinforcements, and supplies for the units still in the field. And a high U.S. military source says the Marines will continue to patrol a few key locations across the border as long as Khe Sanh remains open. When the missions are on this side of the border, U.S. Marine advisors are often involved, and one advisor at a time has been authorized to fly over Laos when needed as an airstrike and artillery coordinator. Along with the Marines, elements of the South Vietnamese 1st Infantry Division are moving up by truck to help secure western protective positions, but only on this side of the border. Their presence is clearing the way for some U.S. infantry units to stand down. But even among the Marines and 1st Division, the vast majority of South Vietnamese troops have pulled back from the border in a cloud of controversy over their performance. Meanwhile, at Vietnamese command posts like the Operation Headquarters at Ham Ni, the process of packing up and going home continues. Just a week ago, this was the central kickoff and return point for troops crossing the border. Now, the troops are mostly gone, but a littered and scarred hilltop remains, a symbol of the Laos operation. Steve Bell, ABC News, Ham Ni, South Vietnam.
The government of Pakistan said today that order has been restored in...
And Terry Drinkwater in Los Angeles.
Good evening. More U.S. servicemen have now died in the Vietnam War than died in the Korean War. Figures announced by the Pentagon today show that 54,284 Americans have died in Vietnam, and this exceeds by 38 the U.S. death toll for the entire Korean War. The totals included deaths in combat and for other reasons, such as accidents and illness. And they make the Vietnam War the 4th costliest in terms of U.S. lives in American history, after only the World Wars and the Civil War. There's also word tonight that recent losses of American helicopters in Indochina have been far greater than we've previously been told. Bob Schieffer reports.
The U.S. command in Saigon says that if a helicopter can be salvaged and repaired, it is not listed as a battlefield loss. For this reason, the command has never disclosed how many helicopters are shot down in battle. It has reported only those which were destroyed and could not be flown again. By this bookkeeping method, 103 helicopters were destroyed during the Laotian invasion, and a dollar loss by the most conservative estimate of $25 million. Those are the official figures. However, new figures furnished to CBS News by reliable sources paint an entirely different picture and indicate that enemy resistance was even heavier than previously reported. Here are those figures furnished by sources in a position to know. 500 U.S. Army helicopters were actually shot down or damaged by enemy fire during the Laos campaign. About 100 were actually destroyed as reported officially. The rest, some 400, were salvaged in one way or another. Some were repaired. But 200 of those helicopters were said to be so badly damaged they will never fly again. This means that the dollar loss, not counting repair costs, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $75 million rather than $25 million. Asked about these figures tonight, the Pentagon had no immediate comment. Bob Schieffer, CBS News, Washington.
Some of the bravest helicopter crewmen of the war are Americans who volunteer to stay for an extra tour of duty. Jed Duval reports from near Khe Sanh.
The official name of this outfit is Delta Troop 3rd of the 5th Cavalry, but everyone uses simply the nickname Charlie Horse. Charlie Horse is one of many fighting units in Vietnam composed of helicopter soldiers. It is a volunteer job. Charlie Horse and the outfits like it are full of men, pilots and crews, who asked to be here, have remained in Vietnam for 1 year-long tour after another.
Someone has to do it. And most of the ones that stay feel they can do it better than the guys just coming over here. I think they actually believe that or they feel the same way I do, that I'm actually helping somebody over here, that I'm actually doing something that's worthwhile. That's why they stay.
In 2 months over the terrain west of Quezon, Charlie Horse lost 14 of its men in action. Men who are close to death are close to each other.
So we'd like everybody to join in while we welcome some of our newbies into our fellowship here. We'll start out by singing a little song. Oh, you're going home in a body bag, do-da. You're going home in a body bag, oh, do-da-day. Shot between the eyes, shot between the thighs. You're going home in a body bag, oh, do-da-day. 1, 2, 3.
The boisterous play includes dousing the new men with beer. The day after the singing and beer tossing, Charlie Horse lost 5 killed when 3 of its choppers were shot down. That day, too, Charlie Horse was rescuing others who were shot down but lived through it. Rescue is not the main mission, scouting is. But they happened on this one, a machine that had gone down and was burning. Riflemen who ride with Charlie Horse guarded the downed bird. There were no enemy around, but one never knows if that will be the case until he lands. Another similar mission. A small chopper, a scout from a sister unit down, having hit the side of a hill. All 3 aboard dead. A man worries about becoming accustomed, hardened to this. He wonders if he should allow himself to make friends. Wonders if love for a buddy has become a luxury.
You know the enemy's out there, and you know it happens, and you see your buddies getting killed, but you just try not to think about it. When it happens, it happens. And I guess that's all you can say. It's in the back of your mind, but if you think about it too much, you can't do your job because you're nervous.
Charlie Horse pilots are fully aware that the danger is constant and substantial where they fly. At least one enemy soldier is seen by the scout.
There's an AK and a pack laying on a rock here. We got a gook.
Oh, we got a gook.
Okay, roll in that little creek there. We're taking fire out of there. That's it, right there, right there.
Okay, go straight up. Go straight up.
Okay, I think you got him.
Well, that was quick. First thing out, and he got a gook.
Put some 50 in there before we look. Good idea.
That's it. That's it, my friend, right in there. Oh, that's beautiful, beautiful.
We really caught him with your pants down.
Yeah, right, your pants down.
In the evening, they commute home to Quang Tri, but they do not get away from the war.
Oh God, our Heavenly Father.
Near where Charlie Horse parks its machines, there is a small, spare chapel. The men of the outfit who are killed are remembered with dignity and brevity.
So we have faith that you are with us. And we know you are with those who have passed from this life into the next. And so help us to live as those for whom these men died, that we might have life and have it more abundant. Troop, get up. You nervous? Sound task.
When we began to talk to chopper pilots, they often asked us this question. How come the news only reports the numbers of choppers lost and the numbers of guys killed? Why don't you tell it like it really is out there? Now you have seen a little of what it is like. The skill, the danger, the camaraderie, and the death. Perhaps you know, how much it hurts when the dead turn out to be people and not just numbers. Jed Duval, CBS News, with Charlie Horse.
A U.S. officer walked into South Vietnam's Firebase 6 today after spending 9 dangerous days in the surrounding jungle. Lieutenant Brian Thacker of Honolulu chose to stay behind last week when helicopters evacuated other American advisors from that base. He was armed only with his rifle, but said he wanted to cover their retreat. When the communists seized the base, holding it for 1 day, Thacker disappeared. 2 U.S. helicopters tried to pick him up at Firebase 6 today, but heavy enemy fire prevented them from landing. Other American choppers dropped napalm nearby, trying to burn out the heavy jungle growth and force North Vietnamese troops out into the open. The siege of Firebase 6 near the Laotian border is now in its 10th day. The judge in the My Lai court-martial, Colonel Reed Kennedy, said today that he would have freed Lieutenant
General Creighton Abrams, the U.S. commander in Vietnam, is reported deeply concerned about apparent laxity in military procedures at Firebase Charlie II. At least 29 Americans were killed in a rocket attack on that outpost near the DMZ on Friday night. And American military sources say Abrams is disturbed about indications that too many GIs were crowded into one bunker. We have a report on the attack on Charlie II from Jed Duval.
From back in those hills, the North Vietnamese occasionally fire rockets at this base just south of the demilitarized zone. Most of the time, the rockets either miss or hit harmlessly, as this one did, to just move a little dirt around. Last night, 11 rockets hit within the base. 10 of them landed generally harmlessly, but one of them hit with tragic effectiveness. Several rockets arrived, making loud noises, exploding dirt and sandbags, but little else. Scores of men were at supper in this mess hall and ran to what they called the club for protection. Soda, beer, and pizza were served in this bunker, which had a 6-foot thick roof of dirt and wooden beams. Some 50 men were in this place when it took a direct rocket hit. 29 died. Of the others, few escaped without some kind of wound.
There was a few that was hurt bad, that was yelling, trying to get out. And they was all scrambling like rats to get out of here. I'm just glad I was at the front end.
What did you do after you got blown out the door? What was the first thing you did?
I got up and started to get going. I wasn't waiting around for it. I was trying to get over to the bunkers on the other side there. Then I got maybe 20, 25 foot, and my leg was like where the beam headed. And I had to, the boy, a friend of mine, packed me over to the other bunker.
It was a big flash, big ringing noise. Knocked all boards down on top of us. Dirt. Couldn't see what you was doing, just had to crawl out if you could. That's about it.
Cranes and other machines were used in the night to haul the broken roof from the bunker and make sure everybody was out. Little was left the next day, except the helmets of the dead, wounded, and the rescuers. Charlie II and the other bases near it are manned by men accustomed to North Vietnamese rockets, mortars, and artillery. Their posts are dotted with heavy, roomy bunkers. Each has tons of dirt and large wooden beams as sides and tops. The 122-millimeter rocket that hit the club is a Soviet weapon, powerful but with little accuracy. The North Vietnamese fire plenty of them from inside and south of the demilitarized zone. Usually, their large fortifications protect the Americans. Indeed, one officer here remarked, "Sure we get 122s, but up to now we joked about them." Jed Duval, CBS News, Firebase Charlie II.
About 200 miles south of the DMZ, South Vietnamese troops have launched a major new operation in the Central Highlands. The Saigon forces say they turned back a North Vietnamese attack on one of their artillery positions today and killed 69 enemy soldiers. Politicians opposed to Vietnam and to President Nixon's policies there spoke at rallies this weekend at 2 Midwestern cities.
Good evening. I'm David Brinkley in Washington. South Vietnam's invasion force has now been inside Laos for a week, and it is finding the going difficult, the communist forces evasive and hard to find, and to the American air power supporting the invasion, the cost is high. 10%, or 15, of the American helicopters have been destroyed or badly damaged, 8 Americans killed, 9 wounded, and 2 missing. Red China over the weekend organized rallies of support for the communist forces and said they would do everything practical, as they put it,
to end the invasion. They did not specify what was practical and what was not. This invasion, like others, has created a whole new set of refugees, people driven out of their homes and looking for somewhere to go. Many have tried to cross into South Vietnam, where they are not wanted.
These people are Brus, a small tribe from the mountains of Laos. When the South Vietnamese invaded their country, communist forces came to their village and tried to draft them into their army. The Brus refused and fled to this American position on the Laotian border. They were lucky because the North Vietnamese shot 30 others who refused to cooperate. But these survivors said that they were more afraid of American bombing. They said many of their villages had been hit, and they counted scores of dead as they made their way out of Laos. They knew now that they could never go back as long as the North Vietnamese were there, because they knew what would happen to them if they did. What they wanted now was to stay here in Vietnam, but neither the Americans or the South Vietnamese acknowledged that these people exist. Allied policy is to send them back to Laos and back to the North Vietnamese. But one American couldn't do that. He was Lieutenant Jeff Heimbuch, Civil Affairs Officer for the 1st Brigade, 5th Division. He was sent out here with orders to shove these Brus back across the border. But once he arrived and saw them, he called higher headquarters and asked his commander for help.
Lieutenant Heimbuch, what's going to happen to these people?
Well, we're not sure right now. I'm going up through G2 channels.
That's intelligence channels.
Right, intelligence channels. We're going to go up and find out whether they qualify as refugees or escapees, and I imagine that will decide whether they stay or whether they have to go back.
What's the Vietnamese government's policy in handling these people?
The Vietnamese policy is no refugees. They're not supposed to take any refugees whatsoever.
In other words, these people have to go back.
They may have to go back. I can't tell right now.
What instructions do you have from the American command in handling these people?
Same as the GVNs, no refugees.
What happens to these people if they have to go back to Laos?
Well, if these people are forced to go back in Laos, according to their leader here, their elder, they say they will probably be beheaded.
While the people waited in the dust and the sun, Lieutenant Heimbuch prodded headquarters for a decision. And it was only after he told them that an NBC News team was here that he received an answer. The Brus could stay. If Lieutenant Heimbuch hadn't been here, these Brus would have been forced to return to Laos. And for all practical purposes, that would have been their death sentence. Now they have a chance, and while they may never know it, they owe their lives to one American lieutenant who cared. Phil Brady, NBC News on the Laotian border.
On the threats from Red China, nobody knew exactly what to make of them, but the Chinese made a point of publicizing them. They also emphasized that among those attending the anti-American rallies over the weekend were veterans of Korea, where China sent in so-called volunteers to help their friends. And much quoted and discussed was a remark by a Chinese diplomat in Vientiane that, quote, China will never let the Americans get away with this.
This is NBC Nightly News, Monday, February 15th, 1971.
The South Vietnamese drive into southern Laos is over. The last units came out today with enemy forces close behind. The last fire base has been abandoned. American intelligence officers say the North Vietnamese are starting to rebuild parts of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The South Vietnamese withdrawal was covered by very heavy bombing of enemy troop and supply depots in North Vietnam. 200 planes were involved Sunday and yesterday. The South Vietnamese say they killed 13,672 communist soldiers. The Viet Cong says it killed 15,400 South Vietnamese. Secretary of Defense Laird says the campaign achieved its primary objective and that it was cut short by what he called tremendously vicious and violent enemy attacks. And as we see in this report, the North Vietnamese are still active across the border in Vietnam itself.
The remnants of the South Vietnamese armored column on Route 9 came back across the border after a long fight to get out of Laos.
They had planned to return to South Vietnam 2 days earlier, but the heavy combat slowed the retreat. As the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, was retreating along the highway, American armored units were positioned near the border to protect the withdrawal. The North Vietnamese also moved into this area, determined to make the going as tough as possible for both the ARVN and the Americans. The U.S. troops who man the tanks and tracks say they've had a fight on their hands almost every day for the past 2 weeks, and this day was no exception. The North Vietnamese opened up with mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, and small arms fire. The U.S. armored troops responded with a barrage of machine gun and tank rounds. The Americans had to hold their fire occasionally as the retreating South Vietnamese tanks rolled past. The ARVNs seemed more interested in getting out than in joining the fight. It wasn't long before American helicopter gunships and jet fighter planes were overhead. It was obvious the U.S. forces were doing most of the shooting. There was no way of telling immediately what the heavy pounding from the ground and air did to the enemy in terms of casualties. On the U.S. side, casualties have been officially termed light in a series of firefights along Route 9. But an Army medic said the so-called light casualties are too many. One U.S. armored battery fought its way to an abandoned American fire base about a mile from the border. They'd been trying for several days to recover an 8-inch motorized howitzer left behind in the retreat. They also recovered leftover bombs and shells enemy forces could use if they moved into the firebase area. The South Vietnamese weren't the only ones getting out of Laos. A group of Montagnard refugees said they fled on foot when the fighting got close to their village. South Vietnamese troops counted 32 refugees, but the Montagnards said there were twice that number still trying to get out. But with the retreat of the South Vietnamese Army, the heaviest fighting seems to be shifting to South Vietnam. When the South Vietnamese moved down this road into Laos, there was very little enemy resistance. Now that the ARVN are pulling back, the process of retreating is much more painful. George Lewis, NBC News, on Route 9 near the Laotian border.
Now that the South Vietnamese operation in southern Laos is over, we are beginning to get reports of how it went as far as the South Vietnamese troops are concerned. From our bureau in Saigon, we get a picture which is slightly different from the judgment made the other night by the president on television. His figures showed 22 South Vietnamese battalions in the operation, 4 of which got into trouble. Figures from Saigon show 2 armored squadrons and 30 battalions involved at one time or another, 8 of which had problems. Problems, in some cases, meant being overwhelmed by superior and outnumbering enemy forces, and in some cases, as the administration admits, the South Vietnamese did not fight well, so that is a mixed picture. The drive into Laos put 2 Ranger battalions north of Route 9, an armored brigade, and a total of 3 airborne brigades along the highway, and south of the road, 3 regiments of the 1st Infantry Division. There were some instances of command difficulties. One South Vietnamese commander, his unit under heavy fire, pulled a gun on an American helicopter pilot and had himself lifted out, leaving his men behind. We have information that General Nguyen Xuan Lam, the South Vietnamese commander of the whole operation, had trouble with his subordinates and made more than one trip down to Saigon to get the personal help of President Nguyen Van Thieu. Overall, there were countless examples of South Vietnamese bravery and good performance. But it's also true that under heavy enemy pressure, the South Vietnamese very often came out second best, even with American air power. David?
The Paris peace meeting scheduled for tomorrow will not be held. North Vietnam refuses to attend to protest, it says, the American bombing in their country.